Hey, hello. If you haven't seen the previous two videos, what we're talking about here is saving humanity from wars, corruption, and just general fuckery. I am describing an administrative system where representatives are optional because, for the first time in our history, we have the technology that enables us to vote securely and efficiently on all matters of governance, so we can expand our democratic power from what we have now, which is picking leaders every few years, to direct control of the actual decisions that our leaders, make at their jobs. So, the main premise why we want to do this is that if the decision for whether or not to start a war is left to the people, rather than to a handful or even a single individual, then the population is infinitely less likely to pick aggression over peace. So that's the immediate benefit. I would say benefit doesn't even describe it, because you cannot quantify the value of peace at a time when countries are armed with nuclear weapons. And if you're under the impression that, like I heard many people say, many even military experts or just, experts, people with various credentials, they say in different interviews that the risk of nuclear or the probability of nuclear war is low. If you think that, then you don't understand statistics, because the more time you are exposed to this low risk, the higher the risk becomes. Just like if you throw a dice multiple times, it's more likely to land on a 6. But this is more like I feel like this is like a coin toss, with all this aggressive public dialogue between country leaders and the arms race for more, for faster delivery systems for the warheads. So no, I don't think the risk is low. I heard another argument to justify a low risk, that Putin or Kim Jong or whoever is in charge of the decision to launch a nuke, they realized that with mutually assured destruction, then if they were to push the button, they would get wasted as retaliation, and they're not suicidal. And I'm not particularly stupid, but for the life of me, I don't understand how 8 billion people are just staking their lives on the fact that the single individual is not suicidal. I mean, what if he is suicidal? Should we all just pack it in because one guy with a big ego would rather be dead than wrong? Which, by the way, if a psychologist can confirm that this is not a very rare occurrence among hyperinflated egos. Yeah, well, actually, I think I understand how we got into this position. It's the whole boiling frog phenomenon. You know, how to boil a frog alive. You put it in lukewarm water and then steadily raise the temperature so that the frog doesn't perceive any sudden change in temperature. Because if you drop it in boiling water, it's going to jump out, take to the streets, protest, flip cars and set them on fire, all of that. So that's us. We're conditioned to accept the norms of society, but I don't mean that we're not just from a behavioral standpoint conditioned. There's a strong genetic component. Our success as a species is entirely due to our extraordinary ability to cooperate. However, this safety in numbers thing is not specific to us. So we have it encoded at the fundamental level of our being. And historically, the group society, it was the only thing that brought peace of mind. We huddled together to protect against predators and against other groups that were attacking us. And especially when other groups were attacking us, we were okay with having a central leadership if it meant that we could organize ourselves quicker and repel the attackers. Now, the reasons why we were attacking each other in the past are gone. We have the technology to ensure decent living standards for everyone, even with all these environmental challenges. But old habits die hard, and the leaders just can't seem to shake this monkey off their back. They keep going back to using external threats to consolidate power, and we are, like I said, conditioned to believe them. So that's why we put up with this boiling water situation that we're in right now. And also because there's no real alternative. I mean, for dictatorships, yes, I guess there's democracy as an alternative, but it's not like there's a night and day difference between the standard of living in China, for example, and the United States, or even between Russia and the United States. I mean, yes, the people don't have as many freedoms and they're poorer, but if you couldn't tell the type of government from just being there. Like, they have nice clothes, they have coffee shops, dating apps, nightclubs, and so forth. Of course, if you look at a country like North Korea, there's a night and day difference there, which is why they keep it locked down. Nobody has internet access, because if they knew how life is outside of that country, they wouldn't put up with it. But that's not cutting the internet entirely in countries like Russia or China. That's not an option. So if we can create a way of life that is as attractive for the people living under these two dictatorships as it would be for the people in North Korea to be living literally anywhere else, that's the kind of soft power that would lead to people craving regime change. Okay, now that I got you good and outraged, or at least dissatisfied about our outdated civilization management solution, let's continue talking about the new one. Last time we talked about how we can all vote. It wasn't possible to vote over the internet until recently, before smart contracts were a thing, because the centralized voting system would be impossible to audit. It would be the biggest target for hackers, but also it would be very tempting for the admins. They would be very incentivized to manipulate the results. However, we can now vote on a distributed application, also known as a smart contract, which means that we all keep track of the process simultaneously, and in terms of transparency and security, it's like orders of magnitude superior to paper ballots. And it's also more efficient because you don't need to count the votes, and you also don't need to set up a polling station. It's much cheaper. The effort to move from paper ballots to voting on a distributed application is also not that great. I mean, let's take the United States as example, where people need to register to vote. So that's when they would just get assigned a token, and that attests their eligibility, and based on that they can interact with the voting application. And literally the only thing required of them is to keep their private key private, but also not lose it. So that's the only thing they need to do. And what this enables is organizing nation-level elections as often as necessary. So basically, whenever there's an important decision to be made, like voting on a bill at a national level, also at a local level, whatever the case may be. But everyone would have the option to vote. Would everyone have the time to read all the bills, the proposals, and make informed decisions? Obviously not. So this system would also allow you to delegate someone with your voting power, like a politician. But you can also revoke this voting power at any time, for any reason. Now, the thing that brings it all home and solidifies this mechanism as ultimate authority is having national currency be a part of it. Because the administration runs on money, and the democratic consensus needs to be basically inseparable from the allocation of the budget. That way, you can't have anything getting in between the will of the people and the enforcement of their decisions. I can only imagine how shook some people may be if they heard about this. I mean, there you have the Federal Reserve, and you have the global economic system that relies on the current version of the dollar. And obviously you couldn't have these centralized exchanges convert the entire volume of dollars in circulation like the ones that we have now, Binance, Kraken, and the like. But it doesn't even need to happen that fast. Let's just take a look at how this would take shape from the bottom up, so like a grassroots implementation. I was pointing out in the last video that the economy relies on transacting goods and services that are generated by the workers. I mean, this is common sense. So from raising chicken to driving trucks, from writing advertising copy to accounting, firefighting, rub and tug massages, the economy consists of all types of work. And there are financial and legal structures that are built on this work, like companies and the stock exchange. But at the base level, it's all just human labor. And the basic building block of the economy is the transaction. Each transaction always has two sides, right? A buyer and a seller. That's true for a single professional providing independent services like a self-employed plumber, or for a group of people working together like Apple Incorporated. Legally, the object of the transaction needs to be specified along with some parameters. Now, an ice cream vendor on the street is not going to sign a contract with each person that comes to buy one, right? But they do have a general contract with the state in the forms of articles of incorporation and also licenses that they have to obtain and then abide by. And there's a whole legal framework that constrains both the buyer and the seller to an expected behavior and also holds the object of the transaction to a certain standard of quality. The receipt that you get when you buy an ice cream just says the name of the legal entity, the product, the date, and the price. But all the legal constraints are implicit into this, and there are ways of recourse if either the buyer or the vendor are behaving outside of the legal expectations. Now, looking at this example, on this new on-chain economy, the vendor would need to publish a smart contract when they go into business, and that contract would have there would be a template for the specific activity that they do, and there would be a function to transact, to sell the ice cream. The buyer would call that function to initiate the transaction. When approving the transaction, the buyer can see all the same pieces of information that you get on the receipt, namely the name of the legal entity, which is the name of the contract, the function. Also, you see what interfaces it implements, so basically the template for the street vendor, the name of the product, which is the function, like I said, and the price, of course. Once the transaction is executed, whatever tax the vendor has to pay, it gets automatically routed into the treasury. Not only that, but the ice cream, if the ice cream business has multiple owners, or if the vendor has loans, that can get automatically routed, so there's no accounting necessary. Now, what's the actual currency used in this transaction? I mean, when this starts, when we first start this system, all the dollars would be off-chain in banks, right? Let's just put this aside for a second and think about the mechanisms for this economy from a first principles perspective. So you're the buyer, and you would also be a member of a working member of the population, or you would be supported by a working member of the population. If you're a child or a housewife, you need to have some sort of value to offer to the ice cream vendor that is tied to a legitimate source of value for the community. So let's say you're a plumber and that's the service that you provide. You would have your own contract on chain for transacting with your customers. But anyone can see how your business is performing. They can look at your contract and see how much you're charging and how often you have, like how your business is doing. That means when you go to buy an ice cream, there can be an instantly established parity between the value that the value of the ice cream, and which is set by the market competition, and the value of the plumbing service, which is also set by market competition. And because every business operating in this framework can be tokenized, that means that you can pay the ice cream vendor in your own tokens, which are basically just like vouchers for your plumbing business. So you can think of this as a tokenized version of barter, or you can also think of it as a stock exchange implemented at the base level of the economy rather than at the top. Now, obviously, the ice cream salesperson, they would want to be able to convert that value immediately into other things that they need. Let's say that based on the market value, a specific plumbing service is worth 20 ice creams. Like fixing a leak pipe is $100, and then ice cream is $5. Well, if you take away this centralized universal currency, then the only way you can capture the value of your ice cream is to sell another 19 more to the same plumber, and then actually suffer from a leaking pipe so that you can claim that service or find someone else. So find someone who offers something that you need, like Netflix. Let's say you need a Netflix subscription, and then Netflix should have a leaking pipe that they need fixing, but they also should have 95% of the plumbing service, so they only need the 5% that you got when you sold the ice cream. And also the Netflix subscription should cost exactly 5% of the plumbing service. So it's quite a nightmare, right? But this loop closing function and connecting the right consumer with the right producer is ultimately the point of having a universal token of exchange. It represents the balance of debt between the individual and society. So any community that is diverse enough from a professional standpoint to generate the majority of goods and services required by its members can have its own viable universal currency. The trouble with current fiat, so national tokens of exchange, is that they have a very abstract connection to the actual material value that they represent. I don't mean like, obviously you can take your dollars and go and buy something, and that's a very straightforward connection. But the process by which it is anchored in the material value is very convoluted. So much so that by the time a certain value loop is closed for any two random transactions, the price of what was traded is dramatically different. I mean, can be dramatically different, which is why we have these periodic financial meltdowns. And the fact that the government has the unilateral power to dilute the currency, that is not helping evade market crashes. I mean, in the short term, it might patch things up, but it sets you up for a bigger crash. And also, corruption and poor management aside, the current fiat tokens suffer from leaks all across the value chains that they support. I mean, the actual production cost of a transaction, if you look at how much it costs for a bank to just move some numbers around on their servers, I think it's 1,000,000 times less than what they're charging. Of course, the running costs of a bank are not limited to the electric current that it takes to just compute and write some data on disk, but there is also no reason today to support the banking system with an asset infrastructure that was designed to protect physical currency. They have all these buildings and so many people, and it's very bloated. So, a digitally tokenized implementation of the barter model would basically be like I said, a stock exchange at the base level of the economy, and it would be constantly self-regulating and recalibrating with every transaction. And even though there would be a universal token, the value loop would be very short, meaning that you can directly trace the fruits of someone's labor to how you can see how that is converted to the work of another economic agent, with none of these overheads and without depending on the stability of the entire system, which, you know, ironically would make it much more stable and predictable. But just because we're moving the economy on chain, that doesn't mean we need to recreate the business relationships that are already up and running, or for that matter, there's no need to create new institutions, new laws. In fact, the less disturbance, the better, not only internally, but internationally in the geopolitical space. You don't want any aspect of this transition to constitute a vulnerability. So, you want to maintain your role within the international balance of power, while this continues to be the de facto mechanism for maintaining whatever peace we have. Yeah. Here's a version of not necessarily a roadmap, but a few steps which the order of which can be interchangeable, I guess, but some things that need to happen for this to get implemented. And let's continue to use the United States as the example. I guess the first thing, this is a prerequisite. It needs to be wanted by the people. So that means gaining popular interest and enough people understanding the technical details to convince the non-technical people of its safety and viability. And if enough businesses operate as DAOs, that could constitute critical mass for a president that runs on this type of platform to get elected and to also have support in Congress. The next step would be to pick the consensus network. You can also pick this ahead of time. I would argue in favor of something like the new proof of stake version of Ethereum, because it would be solid enough as main layer, because it's secured by stakeholders worldwide. You know, also a precedent would be very helpful. So if a smaller economy like Estonia or Switzerland were to migrate to this chain, that would go a long way in terms of added security. Also, I think the Labour Party in UK might be interested in adopting this model. Spain might also be a good candidate because of the success that the Mondragon Corporation is having over there. So this is basically a off-chain federation of cooperatives. But the point is that the more stake you already have in this chain, in this network, the more secure it is against potential bad actors and attacks. Now, we also need nodes and node clients, lots of them. So these are apps that run a full node by accessing their local ledger, or they run a wallet by accessing a random node through RPC calls, which would make them be able to run on modest hardware, like even wearables. So yeah, we need clients to access to communicate with the chain and the smart contracts, and we also need to develop our source contracts, our main contract. This would be sort of like a constitution / treasury, and it's the contract that governs most important aspects of the administration, like the consensus for approving spending proposals and the logic for starting and operating businesses. Initially, this can also serve as bridge to the old banking system, allowing people to migrate their old dollars on chain, and we could have a hard cap at the total dollars in circulation, which I think is something like 2.4 trillion right now. And the nice thing is, because the old old banking system is so sluggish and it's so rigid, it wouldn't do anything to prevent this. This transition is basically its deprecation, but it would serve its final purpose. So the source contract holds the minting function that allows people to buy on-chain dollars using their own old dollars, right? So the way this happens, this minting function can only be called by a few privileged nodes, which are sort of like Oracle nodes that are basically running a virtual version of the standard banking COBOL mainframe, but inside a secure enclave with remote attestation. I apologize for this outburst. Let me just back up a little bit. The point here is that you want to make sure that these banks that are serving as gateways for the buying on-chain dollars, as they're minting these on-chain dollars, they're also burning the old ones that they get from users. So they should not even have read access to what's happening in their servers. And the migration of the dollars would happen, I guess, in the same rate as more businesses accept on-chain payments. There's a fundamental difference between voting in a DAO right now, on-chain, and how territorial administration set up their elections. Because in a DAO, your voting power is proportional to the amount that you contributed in tax. And this makes sense for multiple reasons, but mainly for security purposes. We periodically develop new and better logic for our source contract, and the way we upgrade is to migrate all the funds to a new contract that we deploy on chain. Now, if voting wasn't weighted by how much each member contributed, and if you had the equal voting power for everyone, then you would need to invest a lot of time and resources in vetting people before allowing them to join as a new member, to make sure that they don't collude and steal your treasury, because we each put 10% of what we make into the treasury, and this is the budget for collective expenses like paying rent if we have a physical location, or marketing to get more clients, or team building activities, whatever. But if every new member would have equal voting power, that means they could vote to migrate all of our savings not into an updated version of the source, but into just somebody's wallet. So as things stand right now, we have this proof of work situation by which your influence in the organization is tied to how much you brought in by your own work. And because there's no executive leadership, and we have this truly flat hierarchy, the difference in income is not that big. I mean, of course, different people have different hourly rates depending on their seniority and also their performance, but it's never a situation like you have in these companies where the difference in income between the CEO and an employee is 1000x. So this is very helpful, which would bring me to a very controversial issue, I guess. Maybe it's not controversial now, but if it became a public subject of public debate, I think it would be. So, should people who don't pay taxes be allowed to vote? Well, if this were to be implemented right now, this weighted voting mechanism, it would be very undemocratic because because of the wealth disparity. You would literally have a few rich people controlling the outcome of the vote. I think right now I heard something like 26 people have as much money as half of the world. So almost 4 billion people with as much money as 26. Now I'm sure you don't believe that these 26 people are that much more hardworking or smart than the rest of us. The amount of resources that these people are concentrating is not a direct result of their value, of their personal value output. I think just like the poorest people who can't afford the roof over their heads, the super rich are a symptom of a flawed economy. So if professional organizations adopt this democratic framework, then all the members capture the value of their work. Again, not equally, because people are different in their value output, but you also wouldn't have this massive difference in income, and there can be an election system that is calibrated by the contribution of all members, and there's no risk of it ever becoming oligarchy. So existing companies can migrate to a DAO model, whether the owners of the company like it or not. And let's be clear about one thing. Whatever non-human assets a company may have are not worth anything by themselves. What gives them value is the willingness and the ability of the employees, of the human resources, to use those assets, whether they be telecommunications networks, cargo ships, or egg yolk separators. So if you have the human capital, and especially if it's a group of people that were already proven useful in a centralized company, it will be very easy for them to attract the necessary means of production through investments from established DAOs who want to participate in the on-chain venture capital scene, and then they put some of the money in their treasury, they put that to work through investments. But you see how this all stays distributed. Now, if the investment becomes the dominant means of funding rather than the loan, that would also break us free of this debt cycle that causes the economy to periodically crash. But the question arises, and I hear this, a lot of people ask me, would Jeffrey Bezos be allowed to bring all his wealth into this new system? Well, yes, obviously. Of course you would. Everyone who has dollars must be able to bring them on-chain, including the national reserves of other countries. Does this mean Jeffrey Bezos will have 1,000,000 times more voting power than the average Joe? Absolutely not. He can only spend that money buying goods and services that DAOs produce and offer. So if he does want to operate in a legal entity on chain, then with more than one member, then he needs to make it a DAO. That's where his voting power in national elections would come from. The money that he's earning, not the money that he's starting with. But anyway, I don't think weighted voting should be implemented until the economy is fully migrated or 99% migrated. I think equal voting power for all citizens should be maintained, and then at a certain point, you make a proposal, somebody makes a proposal to change it, and it becomes subject to popular vote. The nice thing is, with this governance system, the absolutely wonderful thing is that it can reshape itself at will. It can drop parts of its logic and adopt new functions very quickly, at will, and from building products, we know that the quicker we can iterate, the quicker we can land on a successful configuration of features. However, it's not like we can, adopt the move fast and break stuff mindset when it comes to our actual society. We would prefer to not break the society if at all possible. Here's a question that, when I hear it, it sounds very insulting to me, and it may sound the same to you, but I've heard it asked by a lot of people with high credentials, so let's address it. Are the people fit to lead themselves? Wouldn't that create an opportunity for certain resourceful bad actors to capitalize on mass manipulation and misinformation? Well, right now we do have these bad actors, but yeah, then they're doing just that. But I wouldn't. I would say that the vast majority of social media posts containing objectively false claims originate from people that aren't necessarily motivated by malign intentions. They just cater to their built-in need to feel significant. And adopting a position that is against the grain, so to speak, can deliver an almost instant hit of significance. which of course we can even put in terms of biochemistry. So, like I was saying in the last video, we're not just conditioned to be wary of any ideas that are rapidly growing in popularity, but some of us also are incentivized to do so in the sense that we form a habit to elicit emotional stimulation through our social media content. So that's to say that we post something that is controversial, and so that the people have strong opinions and reactions, and in turn it gets us all worked up and emotionally excited, and we become addicted to this particular way of making ourselves feel more alive. I couldn't estimate with any degree of certainty the extent to which this phenomenon as a whole is causing discord online, but or offline in general, but I did look into it last year, into the public discussion around the vaccines, and made quite a comprehensive analysis through various social media listening methods, clustering users and posts with similar features, and I could not identify a consolidated effort behind the various conspiracy theories, like the vaccines contain tracking chips made by Bill Gates, or that they make metal stick to your skin, or that the 5G antennas are working with the vaccines to turn the frogs gay. The all facts point to these things just arising out of too much free time, to put it nicely. Now, for the other subjects, I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case with what's happening in Ukraine. I wouldn't be so quick to rule out one or more very centralized reality skewing efforts. And we know that ideas are contagious regardless of their source. They just spread along certain compatible channels. So I guess there's a legitimate question to ask: how big is the danger of destructive ideas camouflaged as constructive through misinformation, gaining the popularity and official acceptance in this direct democracy? I think even in this chaotic manner in which we're conducting public debates on social media, the risk of war, which is what we're talking about here, would be lower than what we're exposed to right now. But of course, this wouldn't be how we conduct our debates. We would have a procedure, right? Just like there's a procedure right now in Parliament. We need to have something that is along these lines, but at the level of the entire population. You're probably thinking that would be very difficult to implement. Well, actually, it would be very easy, barely an inconvenience. Anyway, it would be very easy, especially if you have a binary type of outcome. So you have a proposal, and we can either accept it or reject it. Instead of just an endless stream of comments, we can have a very structured way of pairing arguments with the counter arguments, and have a navigable debate tree with the main thesis at the top, which would be the proposal, and then branching downwards with canal have all the pros and cons. If you're not familiar with this model, please go to kialo.com. That's KIALO, and you can see it, how it works. And imagine attaching to that particular model your reputation to whatever argument that you want to make in favor or against a certain proposal. So imagine Kialo, but with reputation. And I don't mean your actual identity or anything like that, but just a score that shows how much you paid in tax and consequently your voting power. And yeah, I'm sure that this would make for a very, very civilized and productive large-scale debate framework. And something else that I want to say regarding this issue, that people aren't ready to govern themselves, because this comes from I think this comes from a perceived superiority It also denotes lack of trust in our own species, and it's fundamentally undemocratic. It's like saying, yeah, these poor dumb people, they don't know what's good for them. They need a shepherd to herd them around. Which, again, if we're not smart enough to understand or recognize what's good for us, how are we even smart enough to elect our own leaders? That's why I'm saying it's very undemocratic to think that way. Anyway, let's check with the overarching goal and see what the direct democracy, this model that I described, achieves in terms of lowering the risk of nuclear war, because that's what we're here for, right? So again, let's take the US as an example where this gets implemented. Well, in the absence of leaders, whoever would want to launch a nuke strike against the US would need to make the argument that the vast majority of the citizens are bad, right? Because right now the blame falls on the Washington foreign policy blob. For example, Putin is accusing the US establishment, which is more or less constant regardless of who wins the White House. So that boogeyman would be gone, it wouldn't be there as a pretext for aggression, and potentially it would be also gone as a legitimate problem that the US has. But the point is, it would be much more difficult to justify an attack just because you don't have a handful of people. Yeah, you now have everyone in charge. Granted, if you're the kind of dictator that doesn't need to justify anything to your people or yourself, your conscience, then I guess you can still strike, which means there are still more components that need to be set in place for this to eliminate the risk entirely. And in the next video, we'll look at some more key factors that go into this, namely automation and identity. Until then, take it easy. Bye.